Good morning. It's very good to be with you this morning and sharing in these 3 adult education classes for the State College Presbyterian Church called Order and Ardor, Presbyterians in America. Today, Part 1, the early years 1640 to 1706. The story of Presbyterian immigration to North America is far more complex than I will be able to relate fully in the next 3 weeks. Rather, what we will do is look at 3 quick snapshots from the journey of Presbyterians to this country and then what happened to them here. The period covered in all 3 will be from 1610 to 1789. It is a story of the inevitable conflict of order and ardor. During that period, especially after 1700, almost all Presbyterians who came to America were Scottish or Scots-Irish. By the way, though you will often see the word Scotch used of this people, this word is really only used in the United States. In Scotland, they will tell you very clearly that Scots are a people and Scotch is a drink, whiskey to be precise. Who were they? First of all, the Scots were Celts, who occupied the northern part of the island we call Britain. They have the reputation of an independent, stubborn, and warlike people, constantly fighting one another and all the others who continually attempted to conquer, pacify, settle, and assimilate the Scottish people. And try they did. First of all, the Romans, who finally gave up and built a wall to divide the island of Britain between the conquered south and the unconquered north, Hadrian's Wall. But others kept trying to subdue the Celtic Scots. From the Norman conquest through the Tudor monarchs, father and daughter, to Oliver Cromwell, James VI and I, James II, and the Hanoverian Georges. While the character of the English people changed and developed through the ages, the Scots' Celtic culture of kinship bonds only strengthened and hardened into a remarkably independent people. The Scots' distinctive culture developed from the bottom up. Now, most nations at the time and this were ruled from the top down. In other words, authority flowed down from the top. Down from the king, to the lords, to the knights, to the very bottom layer of society, the serfs, who were virtually slaves. The king was almighty in all things. It was a top-down system called feudalism. The Scots were different. Their life was organized from the bottom up. At the bottom was kinship. We would say extended family, but a more accurate term might be tribe. Blood, kinship bonded fiercely independent people together. Individuals gave their loyalty to the head of the tribe, the senior and or strongest relative of them all. In time, it was thought best for the tribes to come together and choose a king. The leadership of a king would only be accepted by the tribe as long as the king's rule was strong, fair, and benefited the tribe. I have read, the Scots developed a fierce independence, a warrior culture willing to fight on behalf of strong leaders who properly led them, and a system of populism that refused to bend the knee or bow the head to anyone but God. That quote is from Jim Webb in his book, Born Fighting, How the Scots-Irish Shaped America. I commend the book to you. the Scots Presbyterian Church. Which brings us to their church. Their church was Presbyterian, which meant it was organized from the bottom up, not from the top down. Scotland in the middle of the 16th century was a weak, poor, and strife-torn cultural backwater. Its politics polarized by French and English factions with an absentee queen, Mary Queen of Scots. The Church of Rome in Scotland was corrupt from top to bottom, detested by the people and their leaders alike. This was a situation ripe for nationalistic revolt. And onto the scene came the Protestant Reformation in the person of John Knox. Knox and other reformers brought a Calvinist theology to Scotland in the middle of the 16th century. John Calvin and his disciples, like Knox, taught that salvation is only possible through the grace of God. Even before creation, God chose some people to be saved and others to be damned. Predestination. Humankind cannot manipulate God, nor put God in our debt. If you are saved, it is God's doing, not your own. In emphasizing God's sovereignty, Calvinists came to believe that no person, king, nor pope, nor bishop, nor anyone else, can demand our ultimate loyalty. Now, Calvin never taught exactly that people have a right to revolution, but it is strongly implied in his teaching. In 1560, John Knox brought a religious revolution to Scotland, and it took the form of the Presbyterian Church. This church was formed from the bottom up. The other churches in Britain and Europe in the 16th century were organized from the top down. Roman Catholic churches and Anglican churches, the Church of England. Well, in all those churches, authority descended down through a powerful hierarchy, with the Pope or the King at the top, then down through bishops and priests. Lay people at the very bottom had no authority or say in church life at all. On the other hand, the egalitarian structure of the Scots Church was based on the local congregation, the kirk. Power and authority were granted upward from the people of the kirk to a series of elected groups. Authority at every level, beginning with the local church session, was held by elders elected from the congregation, which is a translation into English of the New Testament word presbyters, which is how the denomination got its name. Presbyterian practice is the bottom-up system of church government by representative assemblies called sessions, presbyteries, synods, and general assembly. This is in opposition to a church government by bishops, the episcopal system, or on the other hand, by congregations, the congregationalism of the English Puritans. Calvinist theology, in which each person stood free before God alone, and the Presbyterian practice of a church government ruled by no higher authority, both fitted Scots culture like a glove. These were the Presbyterians who came to America. Why did they leave? In 1600, Scotland was economically depressed, technologically backward, and politically chaotic compared to the rest of Western Europe. By our standards, life was short. The average life expectancy at this time was said to be 35 years. They left Scotland to escape poverty, constant war, and religious oppression, caused largely by these three English rulers: James the Sixth and First, Charles the First, and Oliver Cromwell. In 1603, with the death of Queen Elizabeth I, King James VI of Scotland, the son of the executed Queen Mary, also became King James I of England. Though he had been raised by strict Presbyterians in Scotland, James could not wait to turn his back on what he considered a stern and gloomy church. Once in England, he became a fierce authoritarian who tried to impose his authority on the Church of Scotland from the top down. His successors, Charles I and Oliver Cromwell, were even harder on the Scots. Oppressive laws and English armies kept imposing the top-down control of bishops on the Presbyterian Kirk. Test acts were passed by Parliament, which excluded Presbyterians from government, along with other dissenters. For many Presbyterians, it was time to leave Scotland and England behind. Where did they go? In the early mid-1600s, Presbyterians from lowland Scotland and from England joined with other British in emigrating to the coastal American colonies in relatively small numbers. In general, though there were always exceptions, Puritans tended to settle in New England, Anglicans in the southern colonies, particularly Virginia, Presbyterians in the middle colonies. As many lowland Scots were well educated, they found work easily in various professions and trades, as well as farming. Other Scots, though, arrived in chains, mostly as prisoners of war at the time of Cromwell, but also petty felons taken from the jails of Edinburgh. In total, only about 4,000 Presbyterians came to North America before 1700. But this was not the only emigration out of Scotland in the 17th century. Escaping from the frequent wars, famines, and economic crises of the 1600s, far more Scots emigrated from Scotland to Ireland than to North America. The Ulster Plantation. King James I decided that he wanted a Protestant population in the province of Ulster in Northern Ireland. So he evicted Catholics from their land and moved in Scots Protestants, mostly Presbyterian. There were some Anglicans from Scotland and England as well. They called it the Ulster Plantation. Benefits to the crown of the plantation included draining the excess population out of the lowlands, increasing production on the land in Ulster, and it led to the suppression of the native Catholic Irish population in this most rebellious part of Ireland. Eventually, more than 200,000 lowland Scots would migrate to Ulster. Those who went to Ireland were mostly poor people who had been living a harsh life of subsistence farming in Scotland, where 2/3 of the land is rocky, thin soil, ill-drained, swept by rain-bearing winds off the Atlantic and far from the centers of European trade and culture. Surrounded by native Irish hostility in Ulster, this group maintained its cultural distinction. they defined themselves in Latin as Scotus Hibernus, Scots Irish. Unfortunately, in time, economic pressure, including steadily increasing rents for their land, frequent crop failures, the collapse of the linen trade, and a series of harsh discriminatory laws against all non-Anglicans, both Protestant and Catholic, coupled with the belief in greater opportunities abroad, caused many Scots-Irish to leave for the American colonies during the 18th century, only a generation or two after they arrived in Ireland. Meanwhile, back in England, between 1642 and 1651, society back in England was plunged into civil war. The English Civil War was fought between parliamentarians and royalists over issues of both governance and religion. A loose collection of Reformed Protestants, who together were called dissenters from the established Anglican Church, came to take power in the English Parliament. Many of these were Puritans. For a time, Presbyterians also became highly influential. When Parliament needed the support of Scotland in what was, in effect, a rebellion against King Charles I, the Church of Scotland being Presbyterian. To get the Scots' help, England entered into a solemn league and covenant with Scotland, pledging that if the Scots came in on the parliamentarian side, they would change the English to a Calvinist Presbyterian nation. Of course, they did not. The Presbyterian influence did not last. But the brief ascendancy of Presbyterianism in England was just enough to produce the Westminster Confession and catechisms, and to turn some Puritans from congregational to Presbyterian polity. Parliament in 1645 called upon 151, and I quote, learned, godly, and judicious divines from England and Scotland to meet at Westminster Abbey in London in order to provide adequate advice to Parliament on issues of doctrine, government, and discipline for the Church in Britain. By 1646, heavily influenced by Scottish Presbyterians, the Westminster Confession was the result. I have read, in effect, a theological consensus of international Calvinism in classical format. It consists of 33 chapters, closely reasoned and grave in style. It states that the sole doctrinal authority is Scripture, and it agrees with and restates the doctrines of the Trinity and of Christ from the creeds of the early Church. Reformed views of the sacraments, the ministry, and the two covenants of works and grace are given. According to the Confession, the doctrine of the internal decrees, predestination, is that some men are predestined unto everlasting life, and others foreordained to everlasting death. In England, however, its reforms did not last long past the restoration of King Charles II in 1660, when the episcopal form of church government was reinstated and the Presbyterian Confession lost its official status in England. Those Reformed Christians, Presbyterians, Puritans, Baptists, and others, who would not accept became persecuted nonconformists, so called because they would not conform to the Act of Uniformity of 1662, which established the Church of England as the only legally approved church. When Presbyterians came to America from England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, they brought a Calvinism formed through the Westminster Confession. American Presbyterians at 1700. By the beginning of the 18th century, the earliest Presbyterian congregations in the American colonies had been established independent of any European precursors. And now, in spite of everything I've just said, many of the earliest Presbyterian congregations were not from the Scottish Kirk, but New England Puritans who chose a Presbyterian polity. The Puritans, whose object was to purify the Church of England, had settled in New England beginning in 1630. They were Calvinist Congregationalists, which meant each individual congregation was independent of the others. This became known as the New England Way. By the 1640s, their enterprise at Massachusetts Bay had grown to about 10,000 people. Unfortunately, the Puritan ecclesiastical order was as intolerant as those from which they had fled. And it turned out that some Puritans were not at heart Congregationalists, but rather preferred a Presbyterian form of church government. As you can imagine, this was not welcomed in Puritan New England, where Congregationalism was the one and only choice. So those Puritan Presbyterians, if you will, moved to New York's Long Island. Some of these earliest Presbyterian churches in America were founded on Long Island by former New England Puritans, not by Scots. Tradition holds that they founded the oldest Presbyterian congregation in America at Southampton, Long Island. 7 of the oldest Presbyterian churches in America were also established by ex-New England Puritans. In addition to immigrant Scots, other of the earliest congregations were blends of English, Welsh, Dutch, and even French Presbyterians. Around 1700, official pressures for the Anglican faith to be established as the only accepted church in some of the colonies, particularly in New York. This led members of some of these congregations to think of joining together, partly for fellowship and partly to preserve their Presbyterian independence. A group of Presbyterian ministers met in Philadelphia in 1706 and organized the first American presbytery. They chose Philadelphia because of the unusual level of religious toleration in William Penn's colony. The leader of this effort for disparate independent congregations to come together in a presbytery was Francis McCamey, 1658 to 1708. He was a Scots-Irish minister, raised in Ireland, educated in Scotland, then ordained back home in Ulster by the Presbytery of Laggan to be a missionary to America. McCamey spent much of his time in the years between his arrival in 1683 and his death in 1708, traveling along the coasts of Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, encouraging new Presbyterian congregations, raising money for their support, and securing ministers for them, with the aid of Presbyterians in London and the Presbytery of Laggan back in Ulster. He also had good connections with New England Puritans. In a correspondence with the well-known Puritan leader Increase Mather, McCamey indicated that he considered it his principal responsibility to find suitable places in the New World for his brethren in Ireland suffering from religious persecution. In 1706, McCamey called a meeting in Philadelphia, and it was at this meeting that the Presbytery of Philadelphia was organized, the first American presbytery. Joining with McCamey on this occasion were one Scottish, two Scots-Irish, and three Puritan Presbyterian ministers. The presbytery they organized was conceived more or less on the Scottish model, but it was totally independent of any existing church in Britain. During its early years, the Presbytery of Philadelphia drew many additional congregations from the scattered Puritan churches of Long Island, Delaware, and New Jersey, all of whom felt a need for the interchurch connections of Presbyterian polity. They brought a strong New England way, Puritan influence to the presbytery, even dominating it for a time. Diverse as the churches in the presbytery were, they were united by their commitment to Presbyterian polity and their common ties to the general doctrinal formulations of the Westminster Confession. Although there were significant differences in the level of acceptance of the confession between the Scots and those whose background was from the New England way. Their word for this, by the way, was subscription, which for some was very strict and for others quite loose. But still, it held them together. They were able at first to keep an orderly balance in spite of their diverse backgrounds. It would not last. What held them together would soon split them apart. By 20 years into the new century, the balance between order and ardor would be severely challenged as American Presbyterians faced their first major crisis and their first division. But that is for next week, when we will continue with Part 2, Schism and Revival, 1706 to 1758. I hope to see you then.